the really simple use case I mentioned at the beginning of like getting access to stuff in buckets. So we can go here, let's look at just this purely public one. There's actually nothing in here. We can set all those access and logging and so on. Access control list here is just as public. So all I need, if I am a bad guy on this, is to get the actual URL of this bucket, right? Which is, let's just find it over here. Oops, I hit the wrong command. Let's just open a tab. It's not really going to show me anything because there's nothing in it, so it's empty, but it loaded, okay? It's just saying there's nothing in here, but it loaded. And if I were to do that on something with some objects in it, then I would get an enumeration. I would get a list of those objects. So the exploit here is really, really simple. It's the one everyone talks about and thinks about, which is I just have a public bucket sitting out there on the internet and somebody comes along and finds it. Now remember, in the early part of this presentation, I explained that within about 7 minutes, if you've got a public IP address or DNS record, this is both a public IP address and a DNS record, it's been looked at. So assume that anything with that public flag is in fact known, and any data in it is in whoever's hands want it already. Let's look at a more nuanced case where here we've got one where objects can be public. So I'm going to switch here to actually being at a command line, and excuse me for a sec while I log into a couple of EC2 instances I want to use for this demonstration. Let's use this guy. So here I'm just at a shell, and I might want to see what is in that actual bucket. So let's do this. Sorry, I've got to find the right command. So what I'm doing here is I'm just running a curl command. If you're familiar with curl, it's just a utility. It's ubiquitous that allows you to go and get stuff from web addresses. And here I've got that bucket name was science fiction double feature. And so the URL is sciencefictiondoubleFeature.s3.us2.amazonaws.com. So I'm going to hit that endpoint, and then I'm just going to pass it to XML lint for pretty printing here. Well, I've outsmarted myself. Let's do it through here. Ah, that's why. Because I could not get the actual bucket content. I lost track of my own script. This one was well configured at the bucket level, right? The access is denied. I'm not able to get an enumeration of what's in there because over here it's not lit public like the one before, all your base. This one, objects can be public. So what does that mean? Well, that means I have to know the file name, the object name. But if I do, it's just simply hitting that URL and I can load that object. Now you might be thinking, well, but who's going to guess my object names? Those object names probably exist in places that you're not completely thinking about. And this gets back to a theme that we're going to touch on as we go into the more advanced kind of exploit, which is via IAM role. Most exploits I see in the news these days, the recent one this week from, I won't think of the name of the company, but you see this all the time. The access credentials for IAM roles often find their way into bad guys' hands through things like old AMIs where creds were loaded locally. I've even seen them found in S3 buckets, even on GitHub. And so if you can find an organization's access credentials for AWS, there's all kinds of interesting stuff you can do. So let's switch modes from just ACL based. And by the way, that's also how a lot of times these object names can be found. So if you have a bucket that is not public, but objects can be public, it's really important to understand what is public in there. And before I move on to IAM, let's take a look at this object. There's nothing here that says it is public. I have no orange label, right? Instead, I have to actually click on the object and look at permissions. All right, this right here, this is the scary bit. So not the easiest thing to get to. Wouldn't be too hard to write a script to enumerate through all your buckets and objects. I'm sure if you search around on the internet, somebody's done that because this is scary, right? And that comes back to, I think, the first fundamental of cloud security in my mind is visibility and the ability to discover what is in your cloud infrastructure. For me personally, I'm just going to briefly show you how we do this because it's the only way I can think is visually. You've got, I'm showing you briefly Fugue. This is not a Fugue pitch. I just want to show you the ability to do things like visualize all of your S3 buckets and whether they're at risk. All of these are at risk. This is my demo environment, and see why they're at risk. So this is incredibly important to gain knowledge of the environment so that you can actually know what needs attention, because this is buried down here pretty darn deep, right? I had to go into the bucket, I had to select the object, I had to go to permissions. Of course, you, again, can write scripts and get this via CLI or CLI or API, but it's a little buried. And frankly, you should be doing this. If you go into your S3 and you see any of these objects can be public, the data in that might be stolen already.